first of all, we're going to talk about comments. So this is HTML part 2. There was a couple comments in the code last week. There are a couple this week. I mean, I made the example, so I'm trying to think. There's a few. You used to leave little notes in your HTML document. These do not affect the integrity of your code. They don't add anything to your code except for a comment, and only the person who wrote the code can see them. So they're in your code. They just are helpful little notes, but they don't like make anything run. So say if you wanted to add an image, you can't do that in a comment because the comment doesn't affect the code. To do that, caret bracket, exclamation point, dash dash. That's basically our syntax for comments. So caret, exclamation point, dash dash is your opening tag. However, fun thing to note, I know that we just went over in a Kahoot that the closing tag for HTML is / caret bracket. Not for comments. Comments are a special one, and we're just going to use dash dash caret bracket. So that's a fun one. Just remember, but you will also notice that you're doing a comment correctly when the comment turns gray. So a lot of your code, it's like black, or some elements turn blue or purple, but comments are always gray. So that's to know how comments have been initiated, because they're always gray. So inline scripting. This is a little bit of a fun little thing. Inline scripting is contained directly in an HTML code. So that basically means that our JavaScript functions are JavaScript, but they're going to be in our HTML document. You don't see this a whole lot, but they can be used for like little JavaScript things in an HTML website. Using it requires the script tag, which we talked a little bit about earlier. So this is to embed JavaScript within an HTML file. It's a little bit tricky, but it's not for your entire JavaScript file. It's for like little things. So this one shows an alert, which pops up as like a little, one of those like little web pages. But that's what this is for. This is not for like making your website do all of its JavaScript functions. This is for very, very little details. And I want to emphasize that, because if you use this script tag and you paste your entire JavaScript file into there, or at least the contents of it, it will not, it just won't work the way you want it to. It might not even like function as code. So I want you to make sure that you're only using this for like little things. If you want to use an alert, you can also just use the alert function, but that's a JavaScript thing. So this would be used to make this, but in the JavaScript file. I see a question. What type of code is this again? So this is actually two types of code that we're seeing here on the web page. This is JavaScript. So this alert, open bracket, close bracket, that is JavaScript, and that's a JavaScript function, which we'll get into later because you're going to see them in our exemplar today. But this caret bracket script, caret bracket dash script, that is HTML. So it's really interesting, but HTML, JavaScript, and CSS all go hand in hand, so you're going to see all of them in web pages. Inline styling. So basically, remember what we did with JavaScript, where we said, okay, little things that we can do with JavaScript, we can put them in our HTML file. Well, we can do this exact same thing with CSS. So inline styling CSS code contained within the individual lines of HTML. Use the style attribute. So remember how we used script for JavaScript? Well, because style is CSS, we use the word style. But in this one, we're not going to use the open bracket, close bracket. So remember how we use open bracket, close bracket? For this one, we're going to use style equals, and that's just because that's the syntax for CSS. So in CSS, we use style equals, or we use color equals. This is a little bit tricky. It's like CSS formatted in HTML. We're not going to get into it super today because we don't have our CSS lessons yet. But when we get back into CSS, I'll talk about this more, but you don't need it for today. Inline styling syntax explained. So the style attribute declares what you're going to add to style. So this tells us that it's going to be a CSS, and this tells us what we're adding. So this tells us it's going to be a CSS. The color property is set to the value blue. This is called declaration. So declaration means that we're declaring. So I'm sitting here and I'm saying the color is blue. That's what's known as a declaration. And that's what we're doing basically by saying the statement. So we're saying the style of this is that the color is blue. And that is our declaration. And that's basically what from this semicolon forward means. Properties are separated with a colon. So this semicolon, or sorry, declarations are separated by the semicolon, but properties are separated with a colon. I don't like to think of this as separating a property. I just think of this as listing the attributes of the property. So the color, think of this as is. So think of this semicolon as an is. So color is blue, break. Text align is center. So we line our text in the center. That's an easier way to think about it if you're thinking about it in like word blocks. But yeah, we're not going to use a whole lot of this today, but it's an interesting feature to know about. So display information in a table format. There are 4 tags associated with tables. 4. Table, we define that we have a table. TR defines a row within the table. So TR, think of it as table row. TH defines header, so table header. The first row should contain every single header. So say if you wanted to have like a column that was like times of day and like the activity you were doing, that first row would be like activities, or it would be the times. You know what I'm saying? And then TD defines individual cells. Why is it D? I don't know, but it is. So this table right here, this is the code that is this table. So we have table TR. So we have our TR here. Oh my gosh, can that go away? Sorry, I'm trying to, let me make pointer so it maybe will go away. Okay, so TH, header, is the name. Age is the name. Or yes, so name, age. We have that. Sam 18 is our content in the cells of our table. Again, won't be using that today, but it's an interesting thing to look at. Table examples. This is our CSS, so this tells us like the border width of these boxes and that we have boxes, but this is the HTML code for this. Yeah? Thumbs up, thumbs down, yes, no, maybe? Any questions? Okay, I see a chat. Do we need to merge the 2 different codes? Okay, yeah, so there's nothing like merging really happening. When we go into the example, I'll point out, but basically how you do it is you like link your different sheets to your HTML sheet. So in your HTML, I'm going to look there and I'm going to have something that says like CSS sheet equals style.css is style sheet. Very rough, but that basically says that everything CSS in this HTML code is going to be found in this style sheet. So that's basically how Replit does it. Replit and like a lot of other programs have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript because they all have different syntax, they're all different coding languages, they all have different styles. And while they work really, really well together, they're best friends, they're all still different. So by having all of these different things, we just link them together in the HTML file, and I can show you how to do that. We're going to talk about that later. So forms, used to get user input such as text dropdown, 3 important tags related to forms, form enclose all the different elements, label used before input element to label it, input an element with many different options for input. So kinds of form inputs, inputs, text, radio button, checkbox, button, number. We're going to see a lot of these text inputs today because our project, sneak peek, is a Mad Libs, and a lot of the Mad Libs questions are like input a noun here, and those are examples of text inputs because they're words. But if we wanted to say if we wanted to make like a math problem in HTML or in CSS and JavaScript, we would use a number input because we want to have a number input answer. So they're different inputs, and that's what they're used for. They're used in different circumstances. So this is a form example. If you want to learn more about it, check the link out below after class, but it's definitely an interesting thing to do. So like first name, this would be a text input. Last name would also be a text input. This would be a checkbox input because you're either checking it or you're not checking it. interesting, but these are the ones we're going to talk about mostly today, and you're going to see the examples of those in Replit. So we're here at Workshop Mad Libs. I'm going to drop this in the chat, but before I drop it in the chat, I want to really emphasize the fact that we are not going to edit that Replit. We are going to fork it, and then we're going to edit it. We had a couple instances of people just going in and then editing that Replit. That Replit is meant to be a pristine copy of code that is functioning and working. And by editing that one, we can't guarantee that it's going to work. And then people want to go back, check their work, and we need to make sure that that one maintains integrity. If you don't know how to fork it, wait for me. Yeah, I see some questions about forking. If you don't know what forking is, I will explain that right now, but please be sure to fork it. And if you don't have a Replit account and you're like the person I talked to earlier, stay and I will find a way for the code to work for you, because I know I can format it in a couple different interfaces. So I'm going to click this link to join it. If you click that link when I put it in the chat, you're going to get taken to this. That's probably Christian. You're going to get taken to the code. We're going to click this button. So it's going to say Willa HTML Mad Libs, because I created it. It's the HTML. It's Mad Libs. We're going to click that button. I'm going to go all the way down here. It's a little tiny button. It's a teeny tiny button. We're going to call it fork. I'm going to click that. It's going to say forking, and then all of a sudden just going to take us to a new window. And it's going to say Willa HTML Mad Libs -1 or like -2 or whatever. It's going to be a number, but now you're going to notice that the person that was here is no longer here, because this is now my own copy of the code, and I can edit it and nothing will happen to the original code, which is good because we can always save the original code. And if something happens to this code and whatever, you can always go back to the original, fork it, and try again. We good. Okay, so now I'm going to go through some really cool stuff in the code. So first of all, I want everyone to take a look just at my screen first, because you're going to have the exact same thing on your screen. So my screen first, just so you know we're all at the same page. This right here is an example of a comment. So notice how it's gray and it's sort of a little bit lighter than the rest of the code. This is an example of an HTML comment. I know we talked about that a little bit earlier, but I just wanted to give a nice example just so that everyone could be familiar with what that is. This is, again, our HTML opening bracket. This is our like utilitarian data. Do not touch this. Like, just don't. It just tells us our character set. This is in English. It tells us that like our width should be our device width, and like all of the other like just codey bits that we don't need to deal with. So it's not content, so just don't touch it. But yeah, so Harry Potter Mad Libs, that's what this is. I made an example for Harry Potter. I did a Harry Potter website last week. I like Harry Potter. And it's also just easy to do. So I just ran the code so you could see the output as well. So this imports the web page's style sheet. I remember there was a question about linking two sites together. If you notice on this side, we're going to have index.html, main.css, main.javascript. This says we're going to link our main.css file, style sheet, and it's a type text is CSS. So that basically means a CSS file in CSS controls the style elements of this web page, and you can find it right here. And that basically just links this file to this one. You don't need to worry about that today. We're not going to really do that much CSS today. We're saving that for a couple weeks down the line. I think we have one more week of HTML, and then we get into CSS. So if you're holding out to make some pretty like color web pages, just hold out for 2 more weeks. I know it's so much fun. But now we're going to get into the web page's HTML code. So what are we going to use? We're going to use these text input boxes. I have a bunch of test stuff here that I was using from before. Ignore that. But we have a bunch of text input boxes here. And that's what these are. So if you see, we have name, input type text, ID, person. And now these all have different parts, but I'm going to go through them one by one because they're the same for each of them. Name. So this right here in between the paragraph tags is what shows up right here. So whatever you put in between here is going to show up right here. cool, fun, fresh, fantastic. That gives people what about coding on a blank page? Are you going to cover that? What do you mean code? Like you just like open a replit and it's completely blank? Is that what that question means? Yes. Okay. So if you open up a replit, if it's an HTML, like, okay, if you have a replit account and you don't know this, you can make a bunch of different styles of code. So I can open up a replit and make a Python file. I can make a Java file. I can make a JavaScript file. HTML isn't really like that. So HTML is going to give you like a lot of this stuff because it's just not that fun to code. But I think like the final project in this course is like you guys make your own project and we're just here to help you. So I think that comes up then, but you need a lot more skill set stuff before we just get into like throwing you guys into an empty web page and saying make something awesome. So I think that does get covered in this course, but it's like way down the line because you need to learn JavaScript first, you need to learn CSS stuff first, you need to learn how to link it all together, you need to know how it works together. So that's way down the line, but I think we do cover it. Anyway, getting back to this, name. This is what shows up on screen. Input type text. That basically just gives me an input box and it says what's going to go in this box is text. I know we covered that a little bit, but yeah. This ID, and you're going to see it at each one. So this one says ID person, ID thing, ID verb, ID location, ID names. This ID tag is how this variable is going to be, because it's a variable, it's an unknown input into a web page. It's called a variable. This ID tag is going to be how the computer tells what that, like how it identifies that input text variable. I know that's just like a bunch of really weird code language, but I will show you this in JavaScript. So remember how we have this input file and it says ID person. So name says ID person. If we go into our JavaScript file, variable person, remember that? So our name is actually a variable, var, V-A-R, called person. And we ID'd it as, quote, person, so that the computer can identify it as, quote, person and make it a variable that is named person. And therefore, we can refer to that in our different web pages. So notice how it says person is now a variable in a different part of our web page. That's because we were able to ID it and initialize it in our HTML file. It's really tricky, and if you have some trouble with it, let me know. But basically, it initializes it as a person, and then we can use it here to set it again to person, and then use it again here to put it in our story. So as an example, I think I'm going to run the web page because I think that's going to make a little bit more sense. So I'm going to put a name. It's a Harry Potter story. So I'm going to say Ron, noun plural, spiders, because if anyone knows the Harry Potter series, they know Ron and spiders have a thing. Verb, I'm going to say swam. You know, keep it silly, keep it fun. A location, Hogsmeade. And names, I'm going to say Harry and Hermione. So I'm going to say now create lib. And what does it say? Ron ran down the stairs to find what he feared most, spiders. They came at him too quickly. They didn't know how to stop the spiders. They swam to Hogsmeade, and when they got there, they saw Harry and Hermione, who helped them defeat the spiders. Then they all went to the Great Hall for dinner. So basically, what just happened is our index.html file took my text input, Ron, made it a variable, made that variable and called it person, went into the JavaScript file, said, okay, variable person equals dot get element by ID person. So we go to a document, get the element by its identification, which we called person, give it a value, and then stick it back in when we need it at this given point. Does that make sense? Because that's the core coding lesson we're trying to teach today. So does that make sense? Yes, no, maybe, thumbs up, thumbs down, questions. I understand if there's questions. I know it's complicated. I'm going to go into the chat. Yes, maybe, kind of. Okay, is there anything that I can do to help make the kind of a little bit not a kind of? Not really. We're not coding anything right now. I'm just trying to explain the code. But if you want to fork it, like if you are listening to me and you fork the replit and you're like, this girl is telling me nothing new, I already know everything she's saying, then feel free, like go play with the replit, go have fun. But if you want to stick around, I will be explaining it. Okay, for the people who said kind of, I want to make it a yes. So is there anything that I can do to like help you understand it? Like, is there a question we have? Is it just like we need to go over it again? What's up? I'm waiting for some chats, but I don't see any. Okay, chats. The JavaScript part. Okay, yeah, for sure, for sure. So I'm going to go over the JavaScript part first because that was the first request that came in. So we're in our JavaScript file. This is JavaScript. This is no longer HTML. This is no longer CSS. This is JavaScript, and it's in a JavaScript file. Now, we're going to go through each different part. These, if you've noticed, is basically just the same thing over and over again with different things. So I'm just going to go through one of them, and when you ran the tab and it brought the story. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so that's actually a different part of our code. That's actually this. So basically, the JavaScript, this is a function in JavaScript. So in JavaScript, we have things called functions. And what functions do is you can just make them do whatever you want to. So this function is called madlibs. This is the syntax for a Java function. You say it's a function. We're going to name it madlibs. It's going to, well, this is a null. It's a void function because, see if you see that, it says it's a void function. And that's because there's nothing in here. So if you have that question, come back. I'm sharing my screen. We're going through it again. We're talking about what stuff we can touch, what stuff we can't, what stuff is for us to play around with. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my screen and everyone is here that needs to be here, who wants to be here. Cool. So this title, basically anything in like black right now, this is the HTML file. I'm going to go through the JavaScript file separately. CSS, like there's nothing really in CSS. This just tells us like the container stuff. HTML, anything, so head, don't touch this. Don't touch head. Title, change title. This, don't touch this. Don't touch the links to the style sheet. And at the bottom here, you're going to see importing the web page's JavaScript file. Don't touch that either. Button. Unless you know how to make a button again, I wouldn't recommend touching this. I really wouldn't. I know I said anything in the black. This is an exception. Do not touch this unless you know how to make a button and can like redo that, because if you just delete it and then don't remember how to make it again, it won't work and there will be no button. So this body stuff up until that first divider is basically what we're going to be playing around with in the HTML file. I saw there was a question on because I think that's really important. Okay, so share screen, share. What is div? I saw that question right before. Div stands for divider. So it just like divides up the sections of the code. So it's not just like one long blurb. It's also just for like aesthetic's sake too. Yeah. I'm really hoping that wasn't a question because I can't like see the chat right now. I don't know what's going on. Anyway, so this change, because that changes what shows up on screen here. So change that. Input type text, unless you want to input numbers, don't change that. IDs, you need to change the IDs. Unless you want it to be the same IDs in the same spot, you need to change the IDs. Now, if you touch the IDs, so say I change this to person 1. Crazy, I know. If we go into the main JavaScript file, we need to find person, and we also need to change it this to person1. And we need to change this to person1. And we need to change this to person1. They all need to match. So if you change the IDs, write them down, take a photo or whatever, because they need to be the same in the JavaScript file. If they're not the same, you're going to see an error that says like void, like JavaScript void cannot define function. And that basically just means it's trying to define something that doesn't exist. Because if those things don't match, it can't match them up, and therefore it will think that they just don't exist, and the compiler won't compile. So you need to make sure that they match. That's one of the most important things you can do. Change the variable names if you want. This document.getElement by ID, don't touch that. It's a special tag, don't touch it, and this .value, don't touch it. But anything that's like person1, like change these variable names, and mystory.innerHTML equals, don't touch this, but anything else touch. For this, it's weird how you edit it. Basically, if you want to put a variable in, you get the variable name, you put plus, variable name, plus. Anything in red is the words that were going to show up on the screen regardless and are not variables. So yeah, change the red stuff, but if you want to insert one of your variables, because it's Mad Libs, you end your quotation marks. So each red is enclosing quotation marks. You end your quotation marks. You plus thing, so plus variable name, plus quotation marks again, and then we can start our red again. Yes, we don't have class next week. If you're coming back, I will see you January 2nd. Have a great holiday, everyone. Stay safe. Have a great holiday. Avni, if you're still here, I will answer this question. Do we turn this in? Yeah, you can turn this in if you want to. It's in the Google form. It was in the original chat, but the link will also be in the Discord. Yeah, it's in a Google form. Oh, good, Avni, you fixed it. Yeah, so that's the error that happens when you don't match up your variable names in the JavaScript and in the HTML. So that's it's a good error to have because it teaches you. Yeah, hi, thank you guys. Happy holidays. Have a good one. See you in 2 weeks. Stay if you have questions though, because I'll be happy to answer them. And I will stop recording now.